Here's Patty, whom you've already met as the moderator of our webinar today, and she is here with a Robin Witt, I believe his name is, and together they designed this garden, and you gave it a very big name, Patty. Uh, I just said that it was the RIT Gardens and published it before you got back to me. So can you tell us something about that picture per se, and then you can go straight into your presentation.
Sure, yes, thank you. Actually, the wonderful man in the picture with me, his name is Hans Witt, and he is the gardener out at Liberty Hill, which is the RIT President's House. And I had the privilege of being asked to design this lovely space that's right outside of the front door and is visible by all of the guest rooms in the house. So we put in, and this is when Bill Dressler and Rebecca Johnson were there, we put in this food forest garden, which is something we're going to talk a lot more about in my presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and switch it over to that and get us started. Thank you so much. And let's see, oops, not that one, pardon me. I need to click a different button. You're all volunteers here today. So there we go. Great, well, welcome everybody. I'm so delighted to be here today among this list of fabulous presenters and to help celebrate the important work of the efforts here today, a coordination between a Frog's House and the town of Pittsburgh. And I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about pollinator and frog-friendly gardening. My name is Patty Love, and I do ecological design, education around ecological design, and just I also consult with homeowners about ecological design, also called permaculture. We'll talk about that some more in just a minute. I also work with organizations and institutions and businesses to help them make their spaces more environmentally friendly, their outdoor spaces primarily. I would like to start out by acknowledging the land that I'm speaking to you from, the land that is now known as Rochester, that is the occupied land of the Haudenosaunee Nations, who were the original stewards of the land. And there's so much that we can learn from how Indigenous peoples care for the lands in which they live, because they truly have an understanding of the interconnection of the web of life that exists everywhere. And there's much, much that we can learn from the practices that they have had for tens of thousands of years. So I encourage folks to connect, and especially to visit Ganondagan and get involved in some of the activities that are happening there as a way of tapping into some of the Indigenous wisdom. So these are the goals for the workshop today. I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's important that we create habitat for native pollinators and frogs and amphibians. Also, how you can help. I'm going to do a brief introduction of some ecological design or permaculture concepts. We'll talk about some ways to organize plants and habitat that are beautiful and things that you can plant so that pollinators have food for any season, almost any season, and then have some time to answer some of your questions. So I too find Project Drawdown to be a really inspiring project because so many people want to know what they can do. And I came across this list of the top 100 solutions that was put out a few years ago. And what really jumped out at me is that in looking at the top 20 solutions, the 12 of them either involved land use or food. And what I do primarily, permaculture applies to many, many systems, as we'll talk about in a minute, but I am so interested in how we can grow more food on our land space, which happens to also be environmentally friendly when we do it using techniques that are caring for the climate. So we'll talk about that a little bit more too. So this powerful intersection of how we grow our food and how we use our land is where I'm coming into this conversation today. So you've probably heard that there's a crisis of pollinators. Many folks are concerned about the health of honeybees, and honeybees do pollinate as much as a third of the crops that we are used to eating, especially the annual vegetables. However, there are a number, vast number of other native pollinators. Honeybees, as you know, came over from Europe, and they have become an important part of our ecosystem. And we have pollinators that include bees and butterflies. And when I say bees, I should say things like mason bees, solitary bees, ground bees, birds, butterflies, moths. There are all kinds of creatures that help in pollination, and it's important if we can help support their health. Um, it is said that 90% of the world's food comes from 70 crops that are pollinated by bees, and partially that's because we're eating a lot of food that's based in corn and soy, but still the pollinators are such an important part of how we humans feed ourselves, and of course how the other creatures in nature are also feeding themselves. And frogs and amphibians in general are among some of the most sensitive creatures on the planet. So they're kind of our version of the canary in the coal mine. And amphibians and frogs are suffering habitat loss every time a new housing development gets built on a wetland, and the developer may have to create a wetland somewhere on the land, but in the meantime, the rest of the wetland is destroyed. And so there's just a lot of habitat loss that happens in the meantime. And then when the new pond or wetland gets constructed, it takes a little while for the critters to find it. And it also isn't a natural, uh, it's not a natural wetland. It's something that's been constructed. So it's not nearly as good of habitat as the original one was. And this site that I found actually has a really compelling paper that I recommend anyone who's interested in this topic take a look at reading. Another really important reason, if you can't get excited about frogs for any other reason, is that tadpoles are predators for mosquitoes. So that is a really, really important to make sure that we have frogs in our neighborhood so that we have fewer mosquitoes. This is an example of what some of these techniques I'm going to talk to you about can look like. They can be really, really beautiful. This is the entrance to my garden and last year, and it will look like this again in about 2 or maybe 3 weeks. And you'll see that there are lots of different kinds of flowers, different layers of flowers. There's also habitat here in terms of, I have left some of the dried plant material from the year before. There are stumps underneath the bench. So this is one example of what it can look like. I got really inspired to think about this topic of creating pollinator habitat when I visited this lovely meadow that was on a south-facing slope in Western Massachusetts a few years ago. And it was just completely alive with pollinators. There were all kinds of bees and insects flying around this beautiful, beautiful meadow in September, and it was audible. I made a voice recording on my phone. That's how loud the sound of the buzzing insects were in this lovely, undisturbed space. And that was really inspiring to me. So when we think of native pollinators, those include some of the native bees, the solitary bees and mason bees. Bumblebees are really important native pollinators as well. Uh, Butterflies also help with pollination, including the monarchs and the swallowtails. And then there's a type of fly called a hoverfly that you might see if you have a garden. You might see them around the flowers. They are really important pollinators, as are the European honeybees, which are not native and also do a lot of good work here. In some ways, pollinators are not so much different from humans. They really need the same things that we need. They need a place to live, they need healthy food, and they need water to drink. So we can help them have those things by not tidying up our gardens, for example, in the fall and leaving some of the debris for overwinter so that they have a place to live. We also can help support pollinators by having a lot of diverse food sources. So when we just have a lawn, and especially if we have a lawn that's sprayed with herbicides and pesticides and insecticides, and it just becomes this monoculture of grass, there is no food there. One of the most important food for bees are dandelion flowers. So if you're not a dandelion fan and yet you love pollinators and honeybees, perhaps thinking of the dandelions as um, food for those bees that you love will be inspiration to have you grow them in your garden. And also that the pollinators need water, and they especially appreciate having shallow sources of water. So something like a bird bath or a pie plate. Of course, you want to change that water frequently so that it doesn't become a home for mosquitoes. But the point is that they're really a lot like we are in that they need the same things that we do. And if you build habitat for them, they will come. And you'll see some pictures of my garden a little bit in a few more slides. Standing trees called snags or fallen trees are all really important habitat for pollinators and for frogs. So again, think about not being quite so tidy about how you keep your lawn. If you garden and you have dead plants that die or plants that die back for the winter time, or if you've put in annuals and they die back, you can leave some of the structure of the plants so that the insects and other pollinators have places to shelter and to live over the winter. A key thing is to really minimize soil disturbance. And that is important because whenever we disturb the soil, we might be breaking into the nest of ground nesting bees. We might be disturbing the um, the larva of or the eggs of some beneficial pollinators. So the less soil disturbance, the better. And please, no insecticides. Um, Obviously, insecticides kill insects. So they are really problematic for the beneficial pollinators. And I want to remind you that 95% of insects are beneficial insects. So there are a few that are pretty pesky. We'll think of our friends, the mosquitoes again. But overall, insects are really beneficial. They're a really important part of nature. And frogs eat lots of insects. So we need to have them around. This is an example of some habitat that was built by the folks from the Taproot Collective organization at their first market farm project that's right across the street from the public market. They took these bookcases and then worked with some school-aged children to drill holes in the blocks. As you can see in the picture, there are a lot of different size blocks. There are a lot of different size holes in the blocks. Different kinds of pollinators like different sized homes. Also the debris that's tucked in there, the different kinds of debris, the sticks and logs and leaves, all create a diverse environment for the pollinators to live. And this can become kind of an art project. Imagine these all painted all colorfully and then sitting out in your yard somewhere. So we can have beauty and have habitats that are friendly to the critters that we rely on to help us feed ourselves. Honeybees, again, are not so unlike humans. Just like humans, honeybees require carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and waters to be healthy. Doesn't that sound familiar? Those are the things that I need too. So when we're thinking about creating healthy, diverse food sources for nectar and pollen for the bees, um, most of the pollinators don't actually need pollen, they need nectar, but the bees really appreciate the pollen. We're going to think about growing a variety of nectary plants, protect our native blooming plants. If you have crops, you can let something go to seed. So even if you grow lettuce, you can let one of your plants go to seed and there will be some flowers for some pollinators there. And think about the long season. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I've noticed that nature has this really interesting pattern throughout the growing season of purple, yellow, and white flowers growing at the same time. And as we move through the different seasons, the flowers may change, but that palette uh, is a constant pattern. Um, and that's because the contrasting colors attract pollinators to them. Flowers are designed specifically to attract the insects and other creatures that will help pollinate them. You'll also notice in this picture that flowers that have different shaped heads attract, appear in this pattern. And the reason for that is because different kinds of pollinators need different kinds of flowers. Some pollinators have smaller mouth parts, so they might only be able to feed on the umbel flowers, for example, or like something like a Queen Anne's lace or other things in the carrot family. Uh, Anybody who loves butterflies knows that they have these long probing mouth parts so they can go deeper into flowers. Some of the things that we would think of, maybe even for hummingbirds, are attractive for butterflies as well. Frogs being so incredibly sensitive to the habitat really cannot tolerate pesticides or insecticides, and even fertilizers can damage frog habitat, frog food, and they take these chemicals into their little bodies, and then that can quickly overwhelm their systems. So uh, practicing natural land stewardship is something that's really important for our friends, the frogs. We can also make houses for them by piling up some rocks or creating a little bit of a shade in logs, or even sometimes I use broken terracotta pots out in my garden. They're a great amphibian habitat. So it can be a lot of fun to be creative and think about making homes for these helper friends that we have. So permaculture is a design science, and it can be used to design any of the human systems that we have, whether it's how a city or a building is constructed and organized. We often think of permaculture as a land-based stewardship, and since everybody has to eat, that's a great place to start. My definition for permaculture is an interdisciplinary and holistic design approach that's based in and derived from the observation of natural ecological systems of relationships and indigenous practices of nature stewardship. The point of permaculture design is to strive to repair and create regenerative and reciprocal systems for meeting human needs, while also enhancing the quality of life for all beings, including plants, insects, non-human animals, and fungi. I'm not attached to terms, I'm more attached to the practices. So we can also call permaculture ecological design or regenerative design, systems thinking. And it's a design science that's based in 3 ethics of earth care, people care, and resource share. The third ethic is sometimes called fair share or future care. Resource share is like sharing your extra tomatoes. Fair share means using only what we need. And future care is just thinking about what kind of environment our children and grandchildren are going to inherit from us. There are a number of lists of permaculture principles that all kind of point to the same thing. Basically, we are trying to take responsibility for how we are stewarding a space, how we're designing a system, and we are trying to create a system that can be regenerative to a space. Permaculture is about how we do what we do every day. So where do we live in relation to where we work? And many of us right now are working from home and finding out that it's possible to do our work without commuting, which is, as we all know, there are some pluses and minuses to that, right? Environmentally, it's fantastic. And in creating these resilient natural systems, we're trying to create systems that are diverse. They have redundancy in them, meaning that there's more than one way that a function gets fulfilled. So you might have more than one flower example for a pollinator. And through this diversity and complexity and redundancy, we end up with systems that are very resilient. So they can adapt to change. If there's a little bit too much rain or not enough rain, the system doesn't fail. Gardens that are designed using these principles can look very formal, or they can be a little bit more playful, like this garden over on Broadway. And then I'll show you some pictures from my place, the Rochester Permaculture Center. This was what it looked like about 6 months after I planted it. I jokingly called it my stick farm. And then 8 years later, you can see how abundant and full of life and different layers have emerged in the garden already. Some of these trees will continue to grow. Some of them are dwarf fruit trees and shrubs, and some are ground covers and herbaceous layer plants that will not get any taller. So we have a really diverse quantity and variety of things that are in the garden. And I'm happy to send this slideshow to anybody who wants it in case you want to look at the details for the things that you can plant. But if you're trying to feed pollinators and people in early spring, if you have some things like oak trees and raspberry shrubs, fruit trees are really great for feeding pollinators, as are in the summer, we get into elderberries, and chestnut trees. These are all trees and shrubs that benefit pollinators and people as well. I have some favorite ever-bearing raspberries called Caroline raspberries, and I noticed last year how often I saw bumblebees um, overnighting on the plants. If you're planting things in the herbaceous layer, those are, kind of flowers or vegetables that die back. Think about the brassicas. They make fabulous flowers early in the season for pollinators. Things like onions and bees and peas, borage. We've probably all heard about milkweed being a great food for pollinators. In the autumn, the asparagus plants, our lettuces, our herbs like oregano and thyme all become fabulous food sources for pollinators. If we're looking for ground covers, you can see this picture of a bee on a crocus. So if we have crocus, or if we wanted to put something like clovers in our yard, it's fabulous. It needs less mowing. It's a nitrogen fixer. It's a tremendous alternative to grass. That's something that I would recommend. That's really easy for just about anybody to do. And of course, in the root layer, you can have things like dandelions and daylilies and sunchokes that are fabulous pollinator food and then make great habitat later on. In terms of vines, things like the groundnut, which is a native plant, will have a lot of food for beneficial insects. And then we might also think of pumpkins and squashes as great sources of food for pollinators. It was really interesting to me to find out that it would take an entire acre of pumpkin to support about 2 honeybee colonies. But So most of us aren't going to be able to do that, but every little bit that we do can help. And bees especially really like having fungi around. So sometimes people are a little afraid of mushrooms, but there's a lot of research happening to learn about how fungi are an important food source and also part of the nutrient source for bees. And there are some beneficial relationships there that are being studied. So I would encourage you to encourage mushrooms. If you're growing in a container garden, you can put in a very small blueberry variety and then add some nodding onions that will attract pollinators and also repel some of the pests of the blueberries. If you include some German chamomile, then you'll have even more pollinators and you can make some tea. So even if you don't have a big space, you can do this very thing in a container and feed pollinators that way. And there have been plenty of times where I have taken a plant out of a pot to discover that there was a frog that had buried itself down in the cool soil that let me let out a scream. This is some
Yay.
this is some technical data that I won't go into right now. And of course, annuals are good sources of food for pollinators, such as scarlet runner beans, and they can be planted without disturbing the soil much. So I'm a really big fan of these beautiful, beautiful beans where you can eat the flowers too. I'm a huge perennial fan because when we plant perennials, then we're not disturbing the soil, and the less we disturb the soil, the less carbon we're releasing into the soil. Also, when we plant perennials that are woody plants like shrubs and trees, those plants are sequestering carbon in the soil, and that helps with mitigating climate change. I will leave this slide up while I'm answering questions. And as I said, I'm happy to share this slideshow with anybody who requests it. Let me just look in the chat window to see if there's anything in there that I need to answer. Let's see, is there a
Patty,
different?
said that you would share your slideshow, and also this session is being recorded, right?
Yes, it is.
So
Yes,
if people
that's,
want to see the whole webinar and how nicely you fit into the context of it all, then they could later come and see the edited version of the webinar.
yeah. Yep,
These are
that's,
great slides and keepers because no one could possibly remember everything that you've taught us in such a short time. It's pretty marvelous. I asked, Patty was the first person who came up to me at the Metro Justice Fair in December. And we've known each other for 40 years or something like that, long time. And she said, I'd be interested in presenting. And so I said, well, are you professional? So I went to her presentation out at a church in Greece, I think. And wow, I didn't know she was that professional. And then it turns out that she's earned a degree in business consulting as well. So if you are a little startup person, she can help you develop your business as well. So I'm probably going to be hiring her so I can learn how to make some money for the 501c3.
thanks, Margot. I am going to try to quickly answer some of the questions in the chat window. I just have a couple of minutes. An eco-friendly bird bath without mosquitoes breeding in it. Yes, so you can either dump the water every day or two, or you can put in a solar-powered bubbler or pump. Keeping the water moving will help keep the mosquitoes from breeding in it. There are also discs that you can get that are made with BT, which is a natural compound that's generally considered safe in terms of not having detrimental environmental impacts. So some people will do that as well. So that, let's see, there's questions about,
Patty, back to the bird bath. I read, and we tried it after we gathered a whole bunch of mosquitoes last year. It's called a frog dunk, I think, and you put it in your little pond, and it's not toxic to anybody except the mosquitoes. Do you know anything about that?
I think that's what I was talking about. They look kind of like little donuts, and you can put them
That's,
right
yeah,
in the
okay.
water. Yeah, yeah. So on the question of bees, so most of the pollinators that get moved from place to place are honeybees. So they are European and not native. And they struggle too, because a lot of times they'll be in orchards that have been sprayed with the neonicotinoids, which have been shown to be detrimental to honeybee colonies. So we can help, the actions that we can take is the more organic food purchases we make, the more we're voting with our dollars on environmentally friendly activities. And organic folks are doing their practices really minimize damage to the honeybee population. Granted, when any farmer's tilling the soil, they're potentially disturbing nesting, ground nesting bees and insects. Um, and let's see, I just saw a question and answer, or a question pop up. Sorry, sometimes let's see. If one has a small plastic pond, do you have to clean it after winter before adding a bubbler? I would say that depends. If it's covered in some kind of mold or slimy stuff, you might want to clean it with a little soap and water, something that's biodegradable, and you can just pour that right out in your lawn, and that will be fine. And I think that I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there, and I'll try to answer other questions that are in the chat window. Thank you so much, Margot.
Thank you. And did you answer the question about the you mentioned about moving around, but did you answer about handling wasp and ground bees responsibly?
I did not, because we were out of time, so I
I'll
was
give
going
you
to.
a minute from Robert. Sorry, Robert. I'm going to steal from you.
So I'll say that I'm not an expert on what to do to handle. Certainly with wasps, you want to be careful around them because they can be stinging. Most ground bees are not problematic. It's more like wasps and hornets that are a lot more aggressive. So trying not to disturb them is one way to not use something that's environmentally harmful. Also, with the, like if I see a paper wasp nest going up on my house somewhere or on a tree out in my garden, I just take it down. And if I do that enough times, generally they'll go some other place to build their home. So I hope that's enough of an answer for right now.
Okay, well, I'm glad to see that that Robert is sitting in the background here, and you're soon to meet him face to face. There he is, and you will see that this picture of Robert and his darling wife Elizabeth Carey is very typically Robert, because Robert likes to do things differently. And he's a different kind of guy. You never met anyone as loving and jovial and generous as Robert. And he's working in this business of Impact Earth. And actually, it's the seminar has about 3 parts. The first one has to do with activism and sustainability. And Patty and Robert are both running businesses that have to do with sustainability. So here, Robert, why don't you take it away?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Margot. That was very nice. First of all, thank you for putting this on today. I'm very honored to be part of the panelists and the guest group today. I've spent the whole day outside. I was at the public market first thing this morning at 6. We're there every week, and you know, what a great day it is today. So we're very, you know, I'm really super excited to just have a warm weather day because I get to work outside this afternoon too. But anyway, so Margot, thank you for putting this on. You know, I represent Impact Earth. I'm the one of the co-founders and the CEO. For those of you that don't know who Impact Earth is or what we do, I'll just give you the brief elevator speech here. We're a behavior change company focused on sustainable initiatives, mostly with food waste and keeping things out of the landfill. So that's sort of how we started. We graduated from RIT's Clean Energy Incubator a little over 2.5 years ago, where we were there about 2 years. We're just now entering our 6th year in business. We have 23 employees. We have 2 offices in the Rochester area, 1 in Chicago, and 1 now in Charlotte, North Carolina. So we continue to expand our operations. Our home base obviously is here in Rochester, and that's where I live. I live in Brighton with my darling wife Elizabeth, who you saw in the picture, and that unicorn. By the way, that was at our wedding. We got married 2 years ago this November, and the unicorn is one of our employees. So you'll see him at the Pittsford market in different animal costumes. He comes out and does environmental education for kids for us.
He will be a frog too.
We would love for him to be a frog. So
he's got
Did he get the uniform finally? The suit? That's great. So Nick's a great guy. So again, we teach through and we change people's behaviors by teaching through education. So I'd like to talk first about our K through 12 program, because to us, that's the legacy piece that we leave, is making sure that the next generation coming up behind us, and hopefully succeeding generations after that, are well informed, educated, involved, and then are sharing and inspiring the next group. And so currently we're in the Brighton and Hilton school districts. Obviously, during this time of COVID, we're doing more remote distance learning. We're not physically seeing people at the moment, but it's about 8,000 students, 180 days a year that we get to be in direct contact with. And we've developed an environmental education program that really focuses on 4 main components. The first one is awareness. So when whether I'm talking to an adult or I'm talking to a kindergartner for the first time, the conversation really is the same, which is bringing an awareness about their surroundings and the things that we use. So whether it's a plastic container or it's a reusable container, or we're focused on their lunch, what they're bringing in from home, or the lunch that's being served in school, and that we start developing concepts with them through the education piece around a circular economic model. And what that really means is developing processes that mimic nature, right? So unfortunately, humans are wasteful, or can be very wasteful. We're also can be very inspiring, and we can solve problems when we work together of great magnitude. So we prefer to err on that side of the equation, but it all comes down to how we design things, whether it's a tangible thing or it's a process, and then how that goes through its life cycle, and then turning that into a circular economic model. So I'll talk specifically about food waste in these examples, but we do this with businesses and municipalities and other parts of the things that they do from a sustainability perspective. So obviously we work with farmers. They're growing food here locally. That food gets shipped to the local school. So whether it's an apple or it's a vegetable of some sort, and that shows up on the student's plate. Whether or not the student eats that, they eat it, it's part of their fuel process. They're refueling themselves for the afternoon, or they're disposing of it, or the remnants of what they didn't eat, making sure that they're aware that all that matters. Like there's a reason behind all of that. So just throwing something away doesn't just go away. Nothing goes away. It goes somewhere, and that somewhere is important. So that's bringing that general awareness a piece first and foremost is critically important, and that's where we start. And once you get people's interest peaked, the next part is focusing really on the education piece. And there's lots of different ways to educate or involve them different topics in this area of zero waste or sustainability. Again, most of our focus is on food, but it can go in other directions. So taking that food example that I mentioned earlier, following that through, there's the conversation about using food for fuel and what that means. So now you're talking nutrition, and again, it's not an area that Impact Earth necessarily focuses on in terms of products and services, but it's an area that's critically important. There are lots of other people that do that and do that very well already. So that's part of a larger sustainable network that we're part of. But if you're not going to consume it, and you're not going to take it home to use later, I mean, you're going to compost it or you're going to throw it away. Composting is an obvious best solution. So throwing that into a specific compost bin, making sure that everybody else is doing that. I mean, you're throughout the school district, for instance, or at a community event, or in your home, it's all the same. And then having that collected, and then taking, if you're not composting in your backyard, in that example, we do industrial composting, and we're partnered with 4 or 5 farms here locally and a group in Geneva called Closed Loop Systems, where we're building composting facilities throughout the Finger Lakes region to support the work that we're doing on the front end. And then we take that and we're using, vermicomposting. That's the process that we use. We do above ground windrow composting too, but vermicomposting is nice from the standpoint is there's another educational component that kids are really interested in because it's worms. And so taking them on field trips out to the farm to show them what that process looks like. You can also mimic that in the classroom on a much smaller scale. So those, we bring that to bear from the education side. And then following that through from the closed loop perspective, you make good soil or compost, and then we redistribute that back into the community. So whether it's your local community garden, or it's your backyard flower garden or vegetable garden, or it's going back to the farmer, those are all great places. We can never make enough soil. Especially really good high-grade soil. And there are industries that, with the new farm bill, I'll just use this as one example, with the new farm bill that got passed last year, the hemp industry is growing, and about half of the folks that grow hemp worldwide depend on really high-grade soil. So there's going to be an ever-increasing need for better and better soils moving forward for just that industry alone. And that industry in New York is really in its infancy. So we'll see growth in that area for soils moving forward over the next 2 or 3 years as the hemp industry continues to grow here locally in the Finger Lakes region. So that's, and then of course you're now planting seeds and growing more food, and the process repeats and starts itself over again. So in that example, the next critical piece for us is the involvement piece, which is really, getting people involved from an activity perspective. This webinar series today is a great example of people getting together and being active and sharing information and doing something other than just learning on their own and maybe implementing it in their own backyards. So we have an activity going on here, and it's the process that's associated with that. So in the school district, it's also about changing the regulatory piece, right? What kind of standard are we going to hold ourselves to today and in the future? How is that measured? And who ultimately control or has the say in how we utilize best practices to correct errors along the way, or things that we learn along the way that improve our best practices. So, we help organizations put all that into play. But being involved is critically important from an environmental education perspective. It's not enough to just educate folks and show them. Climate science is a great example here. You can show people facts and science, but not everyone, as we all know, takes that information at face value and actually believes it or does anything with it. So converting that, or taking that next step and getting people involved with that, or on a personal level, is really critically important to sustaining or leaving legacy pieces sort of along the way as we go along. Not every school district that we work with, not everyone in those school districts is a believer in the zero waste principles in the beginning. That behavior change part of what we do is not easy work. It can be very taxing. It can take a long time, longer than you would want it to take in some instances with some people. But it's sort of like a stone rolling down the hill. Once you get it going, it starts to pick up speed. And that's generally what happens when you have, collective action. I was reading an article just recently about environmental education behavior change, and there's a new study out that's been cited over 1,000 times in the last year about the difference between making what they call a long bridge single connection from one person to another person, doing what we're just talking about, that has a small impact on behavior change. If we can widen the bridge with many connections across multiple fronts, from group A to group B, the chances of true long-lasting behavior change increase dramatically. And I'll give you an example of how that's played out in our business. When we started, we were doing we were working with event coordinators and helping them with their trash problem at events. So we've all been to an event, think of the large scale events, Jazz Festival, Lilac Festival in Rochester, all the way down to your smaller events like the Mendon Carnival out in Mendon. And they all have, when you talk to the event coordinators, one of the big problems that they had was they have a trash problem. They have these great events, they bring lots of people there, but they consume things and they throw things away. And there's just a lot of waste that's being generated, and it's unsightly, and someone has to clean it all up. And ultimately what they're doing is throwing all of that into a big dumpster and taking that to the landfill. So, we came up with a solution where we could sort all of that right in real time, keep the grounds clean, and then provide a composting service that was associated with that, and a recycling service, for instance. So that was one connection with people. Then we started our K through 12 environmental education program, and Brighton and Hilton signed on to those. And then that was another connection with another group of people. And then we added consulting along the way, where we started doing sustainability planning and consulting work, feasibility studies for municipalities and businesses. And that was another line of connection. The bridge continued to get wider. And then about 2 years ago, people kept asking us, well, how do I pack a zero waste lunch for my kid? Or what kind of products do you recommend that we use if we want to have a zero waste lifestyle? And so, over time, we realized that people were asking us really to prepare or provide additional products. And so we started our retail side of the business, which has grown tremendously in the last 2 years. And lastly, but it brought in a whole nother group of people, and the bridge continued to get wider. And then lastly, we added the organics piece, where we started doing aggregation at farmers markets. And this year we've added curbside composting to the mix. So we now service all of Monroe County and Victor with that. And again, the bridge got wider. And so the point in all of that, obviously, is that it's behavior change. We are now talking to a wider group of people that are with real systemic or real behavior change, both personally and as a community. And so we've seen that growth over the last 6 years, and it's been truly amazing to watch that. And the last piece is the share and inspire part. So, you know, one of the reasons why we focus on education and kids for a lot of what we do is, you know, they're the ones inheriting the world that we're leaving behind. And you know, I've got 6 children between the ages of 14 and 26, and they all are going to have to deal with climate change in the environment and things like COVID viruses, things that we didn't necessarily have to deal with on a grand scale differently than our generations did. So, you know, this becomes an endless loop where best practices are important. You know, our personal feeling at Impact Earth is that, you know, education is ever ongoing. You should never stop learning and growing and changing, evolving, and then sharing and inspiring those you come in contact with. So that's where I'm at the moment. Margot, did you want me to talk about anything else besides what I've already talked about?
Well, the difficulties of starting a business. Yours is a for-profit business, is it not?
That's correct. Yeah, so we started out as a for-profit S Corp. We've applied for our B Corp status. B Corp is a people, planet, profit, 3-pronged approach to running a for-profit business. One of the most famous ones of those that most people know is Patagonia. And there are literally thousands of B Corps around the world now. And what that really means for us is that through a very critical lens, you know, it's my job as the CEO is through that critical lens to make decisions that focus on all 3 of those somewhat equally. So how does it impact people? How does it impact the planet? And certainly we want to make a profit so we can stay in business, but not to the exclusion of the other 2. So it's a real balancing act. And I won't say that it's easy to, you know, I'm not a serial entrepreneur. I'd never run a business before. I had worked for other people. I'd been in sales for 30 years. So I certainly understood the nuances, but I don't have an MBA. I don't have a business background. But you know, I have a love and an affinity for people and for building things. And so I'm not a house builder or carpenter in that sense, but I love to build relationships and watch those grow. So those things have helped me. I've coached CYO and AAU basketball on a volunteer basis for 20 plus years. And I love putting I love taking all the sort of what you would call the misfits and putting them together on a team, and then working with them over a 2, 3, 4 year period to sort of coach them up. And it's not about the wins and losses, although the wins help keep people motivated. It's really about watching all that personal growth. And there's a lot of life lessons in a sport like basketball or any team sport. Getting people to talk to each other and communicate and work together and achieve small goals and then achieve larger goals and achieve team goals. And ultimately, you know, over a 3 or 4 year period, regardless of what group of kids I've ever had, they always get better. They always grow and they always learn something. So it's, you know, I sort of treat the business the same way. It's a journey. You know, each individual day has got its unique challenges, but, you know, we update the roadmap every year to see what's coming. You know, for example, one of the pivots we had to do this year when we lost 85% of our revenue when everything got shut down 5 weeks ago through the COVID-19 virus epidemic. And I agree it's the right thing to do. How it affected our business, we had ultimately over the next 3 weeks, we had to lay off all 23 of our staff. So, you know, they're on temporary furlough, and that was very difficult Most importantly, I had to make sure that the business stayed afloat during that time of being absent. And we reevaluated our organics program. And started the curbside program. We started looking at what we could make for the epidemic, and we ended up making masks. So we do reusable masks now here locally. I've got 2 or 3 different groups of folks making masks for us, including our own group. And then for every mask that people buy, we donate a mask back to frontline groups here locally to help the network itself. So I think those are all challenges that you have to figure out in your own business and as you go along, but it's not easy.
You're a junior. Was your father an example of such generosity of spirit and heart and mind?
That's a great question. No, actually, it was my mother. So my parents were divorced, and I didn't grow up. My father was not part of our family growing up. So, but I'm the oldest of 3 boys, and my mother was the one who inspired us. She grew up on the family farm. It was a 90-acre farm down in the southern tier, and she was the oldest of 5. She had that generosity of spirit. We didn't have a lot growing up, but what we had, we were thankful for, and we shared, and others helped us along the way and shared with us too. And it just, we learned how to do things. You just keep doing the next right thing.
Very nice. Do you still have about 5 minutes? I think that there might be a couple of comments or questions over here if you look at the chat box.
Okay, let's see.
I think it starts with 1220.
I can ask my question, Robert, which is, I'm wondering if you see any opportunities for municipalities who pick up yard waste to weave into your composting system.
Yeah, great question, Patty. So we're actually part of the consulting team that the city of Rochester hired to look at the feasibility of curbside. So we're about 8 months into that feasibility study. The city is going to be launching a pilot program here probably early summer for some city residents, and that has been part of the discussion. We also work with other municipalities currently, the town of Victor, town of Canandaigua, and others, but we're contracted with those 3 currently here locally, and they all are looking at that as trying to figure out how to weave that in, because obviously the best types of composting systems are one that take all the organic mass that's out there and figure out how to do things with it. Along that same point, because we came out of RIT and my background was in packaging, we're also working on projects that take single stream organic waste materials and are trying to turn those into products. So, for example, the one project I can talk about, we're taking coffee chaff from a local company and some other organic material, and they're turning those into compostable coffee lids. So instead of the plastic lid that goes on a disposable coffee cup, turning that into a completely compostable option that's made out of waste material.
So Robert, last year you delivered a beautiful pile of mulch for the gardens at a frog house, and but the neighbors had taken the community compost or mulch from the town's collection of all the debris that they had put together or they had chopped up to be mulch. And when they were putting it down, their faces swelled up because the problem is that that people use so much pesticides on their lawns that it went into all the leaves and the debris, and so that so-called. In fact, I believe they were spraying the compost, is what I heard. I don't know the truth of that rumor, but we're looking forward. Mary Moore is an important person who's been working towards pesticide-free Pittsford. And what can you do with people who or in a community, how can you change that so it becomes a community-wide practice to not use pesticides and fertilizers that are non-organic?
Well, yeah, it's a tough problem to solve. I do think that from from my own personal experience, my neighbors on either side of me in Brighton both use a lawn service, or they did both use a lawn service, and they sprayed in the spring, and they put their little signs up that said, don't walk on the grass, for the next day because we sprayed, and we don't here. And so there were just we decided that it wasn't enough to just to not, we wanted to make sure that the messaging that we put out there wasn't necessarily combative, but that there was an alternative to what we were doing, to what they were doing. And so we started putting out signs that said, or found signs that people were making that said, I apologize for the unkempt look of my lawn, but the bees are happy. Or this is a no spray zone. Obviously the signs you had last year or the year before that you had at Pittsford, we utilized those signs as well. And I think it started a dialogue with our neighbors, and one of the neighbors got rid of their lawn service and stopped spraying altogether, and the other still has a lawn service but stopped spraying. And we all had children, and we found the commonality and the middle ground there, which was the kids, and talked about really the issues surrounding spraying and pesticides. And I think from there, that conversation needs to be broadened. As you know, Margot, the work that you're doing with the town of Pittsford, and I think that that's one of the things that where you go next is you take it from I'm going to set the example personally. I need to do a great job of messaging that positive behavior that we want to see other folks emulate, and then from there take it and get it into a regulatory piece at the town level or municipal level.
Let me add, this is Sandy Frankel, and I want to note that the town of Brighton for years has collected yard debris curbside, has composted it in our landfill, and then makes that compost available for free to residents to use in their gardens. We also have adopted a policy against the use of pesticides unless necessary for in dangerous situations for health purposes. So we don't use pesticides on public property, the town of Brighton property, and got the county to agree and the state not to use it on their roads throughout the town. And that mindset is one that I believe has helped many residents who supported that approach to cut back on pesticides in their own yard. So there's a mix, but by and large, there's been a long history in our community of being environmentally sensitive and wanting to protect the integrity of our ecosystem.
That's marvelous. Thank you, Sandra. I'm glad to know you're here. You were beyond the arrow. So you're going to be coming up after me. This is a so-called lunch break. I was just going to be lazy and just have a chance for discussion, but then I decided, gee whiz, I have to have my word or two. Oh, I've got tricky fingers. Does anyone mind, or do you want to have a general discussion first before I go into my little mini presentation? Anybody?
Margot, I'd like to suggest that since this, this is in part about the Frog's House, that you take a few minutes to tell us about what you're doing.
Okay. Well, I don't know. My life, first of all, this is my newest little frog in the household. And you saw him before. That's Josh. it seems that I've always been guided by some kind of invisible line that's taken me from place to place, and probably all of you have had the same experience, but I didn't know why I was painting frogs, except that painting pictures of frogs, except that they were interesting and they were beautiful. There are so many variations. This painting here that I'm holding on the left is a homage to Vinnie Massaro, and I've always wanted to have an activity that combined all of my talents, my education as a psychiatrist, my interest in writing, my interest in painting, my interest in relationships and community, and a frog house has really filled the bill for it. But it was frogs who were calling to me, and some people have their own, what do you call it, their own animal, their spirit animal or something. And I suppose mine must be frogs. My designer, Catherine Dennison, who is listening in, I'm quite sure, made this beautiful card out of the painting. And I'm hoping that people might buy either the painting or the cards to help support. Okay, so Patty has already discussed a lot about why frogs are important. And I just want to reiterate this very quickly. The role in the food chain and being an indicator species, the insect populations, research, and nature's pharmacy. Before they had pregnancy tests, they used to use the women's urine and test it with something from the frogs. I'm more on the global picture of things than I am on details, so forgive me for that. But anyway, frogs used to be used for pregnancy tests. And also for some of the poison dart frogs, they're used for pain anesthetics as well. But they don't have to be used for dissection. And that's going to be leading up to Robert and Bill after Sandy's presentation. So anyway, these are the threats to frogs. And Tyrone Hayes was a researcher who did a lot of work on frogs. He was hired initially by Monsanto, and they wanted him to prove that their chemicals were not harmful to frogs. And this was the result of his so-called proof. Well, once he showed that the abnormalities and not only in abnormal limb growth, but also in, sometimes they only have one limb and one little tiny short limb. He also found out that their hermaphroditic frogs were growing. So males had eggs that were, of course, unfertile, and obviously they can't reproduce. So Monsanto tried to sue him, and they tried to knock him down and tell him how horrible he was, and he was a bad scientist, and they obviously fired him, and he is carrying on his work at, I think, the University of San Francisco. But you're all familiar with these 5 things. Humans are probably the worst enemies to frogs that there are. And I think Robert has a cartoon on his Facebook page about that. Maybe you could get it up, Robert, and see about showing it to us in a minute. Okay, so what really got me interested was Martin, who reads all the time. On the door, he's the reader. He showed me this article from the New Yorker magazine, and the design from the New Yorker I couldn't take, but clearly the artist used this image of a frog to do the illustration. And what happened was that Elizabeth Colbert had gone down to Panama, and she was studying the golden frog. And the next time she went down, there were none, absolutely none. It just brings tears to my eyes and choking to my throat to think of it, because it was so sad. And then she went on to talk about the bats that were falling down just in droves, just in the hundreds and thousands in the east. And this has happened gradually and moving west. I don't know where it is exactly right now, but the bats had, and who were also mosquito eaters and insect eaters, the bats had what is called white nose syndrome, which is very, very much connected with the chytrid fungus that is killing off the frogs in droves. So as she said, and as people say a lot, they're older than the dinosaurs. And I thought, this really, well, what's a nice word to say? This really is bad. Here these creatures have survived tornadoes and earthquakes and storms and die-offs and ice and fire. And now we human beings are killing them off. And I thought that is not a good thing. So I got really passionate about that. And being interested in it, I was looking around about frogs, and I found the Save the Frogs website. Carrie Krieger is the founder of Save the Frogs. And this is a nice, lovely, wonderful webinar, but he's having a 10-hour webinar today, right now. I'm missing it because, but I listened to a little bit about it last night. He had 56 people and 18 presenters, or maybe 24 presenters. And this man has just done amazing things. And it's really silly for a little baby to, like me, to try to emulate a giant like him. But I said to him, when I grow up, I want to be just like you. And he said, it's not that great, Margot. And I noticed that he's pretty correct about that. It's really, really, really hard work just to do a little bit. And especially, as Robert mentioned, behavior change. Okay, so Save the Frogs, sorry, is the world's most effective amphibian conservation organization. And as such, of course, with frogs being the indicators and the keystone species, they're telling us, as Patty mentioned about the canary in the coal mine, they're telling us, hey, kids, something's going wrong. And who would see a frog with 4 legs and then get pregnant and let the toddler run out on a pesticide lawn? I mean, you know, who would do that? But in my day, people were smoking all over the hospitals, and people who worked in surgery and saw lungs that were black kept on smoking. So it's a real dilemma. So there were 500 species of frogs per year. Usually one species out of thousands of frogs die every 500 years, used to be. But now there are several dozens or hundreds, I'm not good at facts. There are many, many, many frogs who are dying within the last 10 years or 20 years. So the rate at which they're being killed off is absolutely horrible. So while I'm a local organization, Carrie is an international person, and he has gathered people and done things, gotten things going in 20 or more countries at this point, and has several chapter organizations, including a wonderful one in Ghana, where the leader there has gotten a degree. The kids used to shoot frogs, both to eat and just for fun, and learning how to better point their arrows so that they could hunt bigger life, as if there was any living there. And instead, his name is Gilbert Adden. They formed a baseball team or soccer team, and got the kids involved with that. So it's the Save the Frogs soccer team, and they're doing a lot of frog saving and reforestation in Ghana. and the giant squeaker frog is from there. And so they're big efforts to save that frog. So Save the Frogs also has ecotours, and I've been advertising for Carrie ever since I fell in love with the whole project, probably 10 or 11 years ago. And this picture is a credit to Melvin Gray, who became an octogenarian just 1 year before me. Now, I am going to turn my time, unless you want to comment on it, over to Sandra. Does anyone want to say anything about a frog house, Save the Frogs, how you want to help, anything that anyone wants to offer or ask? Say something, someone, please. Sandra, Robert, Pat, Patty?
Well, I'd like to congratulate you on the work that you're doing there. And one of my additional joys, I mean, there's so many good reasons to walk along the canal path, for sure, on any day. And I hope some folks will get out and do that maybe today after we're finished. So one of the joys is to walk by a frog's house when I go and park in Shone Place and head down the canal path, and just to see that beautiful space that you've created there. So I'm so delighted to hear about the work that's happening there, and it seems to be a natural fit that's happening along the canal, and there is a lot of great amphibian habitat in that area for sure.
Yes, and there's going to be more of it. However, I'd like to comment that we had to take down the beautiful sign that was designed by Catherine, and we have to go through the Historical Preservation Board because apparently someone thought I was running a business. Haha, they only know how much of my own money I put into it. I don't mind the time, but I would like some support of the Frog House, and I'm really, really grateful for the people who have supported us financially. And I want to make it more worthwhile for them to have been part of our partnership. But in any case, it's not for profit, and I think the sign goes under freedom of speech. I have to get onto that question, but as Robert can tell us, there are many, many, many hurdles and things that you have to jump. I mean, even Jeff Bezos, well, he started in college, I guess, getting in people's faces, but there are many. He went through a lot to get where he is, and so even as being a little in the black 501c3, it's much harder than I ever imagined. Oh, by the way, can you see this frog?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was one of our activities. I think it was our July activity, and Maya Abrams Horvath was our artist, and she helped all the kids make their own individual frog pins, and this one was left behind, and it just perfectly suits my personality with my little frog eyes on either side of my ear.
What you mentioned about your sign reminds me, and some of the things that that Sandra talked about just reminds me that one of the places that I think, and I hope that our current situation will be helpful with, is I know that there are a number of layers of legislation, whether it's our town codes, and other things that sometimes make it really difficult to do the right thing environmentally. I have had to go through a number of things at my place in West Brighton because the environmentally friendly behaviors that I want to be doing in my own yard aren't in compliance with town code. And also some of the town codes make it difficult to do things like garden in a place where there are a lot of deer and other garden pests. So I think it's really interesting to see how we can each speak up and work with the folks in our various municipalities to craft code that helps us be more environmentally responsible stewards and do the good work that it is that we're trying to do. So I hope that that'll be successful for you.
Margot,
Thank you. Okay.
Margot, with regard to your sign and First Amendment rights, one of the things that local governments have the authority to do is to regulate certain aspects without preventing your freedom of speech rights. And with regard to historic preservation, I would encourage you to sit down and work with the Pittsford Preservation Board on what they're looking for and what you're hoping for, because quite frankly, a not-for-profit organization is a business. It just happens to be not-for-profit. So you've put the Frog House into a different category, and so you need to be working with them, and I'm sure you can come up with something that'll be mutually acceptable.
Well, how about the idea that in 100 years it's going to be an historical building?